Grace is kind of hard. Grace is not conceptually difficult. I mean, it's easy to understand that the definition of grace is a favor that you didn't earn, a favor that you couldn't repay, that you can't possibly ever repay. And God's grace to us, of course, is something we didn't earn. Our salvation is not something that we can boast about earning through our own works. And of course, we understand it's something we could never repay. We could never pay enough for the salvation earned by Jesus' blood. Those concepts are not difficult to understand. However, the application of those concepts is quite challenging. It's hard to comprehend the magnitude. It's hard to imagine the amount, the measure of grace that was applied to us, not only to us, but to the world, to the eternal world of souls covered by God's grace. That's a difficult, challenging concept to grasp. Even further than that, it's difficult to understand the expectations of receivers of grace. What are we supposed to do? How are our lives supposed to change after having been applied God's grace? Well, the good thing is there are plenty of examples of grace being bestowed, grace being shared in the Bible. The gospel and the Bible exudes inescapable grace. Numerous examples evidencing a proper application and proper sharing of grace. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. I want to go through examples of grace in the Bible and talk about what it means and try to understand some of the difficult concepts about grace. What do we do with it? How do we measure it? A really nice, interesting example from the Old Testament we have in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 15. There's a principle that is the epitome of grace, the epitome of graciousness, called the Sabbatic year. I want to read in Deuteronomy chapter 15, just describing the law of the Sabbatic year. We're going to read verses 1 through 2, verses 6 through 11 of Deuteronomy chapter 15. Moses there says in verse 1 of Deuteronomy 15, "At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a remission of debts. This is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed." Skipping down to verse 6. "For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised you, and you will not lend to many nations, but you will not borrow. You will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. If there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns in your land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand from your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him. You shall generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. Beware that there is no base thought in your heart, saying, 'The 7th year, the year of remission, is near,' and your eye is hostile toward your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then he may cry to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin in you. You shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings." In this law, the law of the Sabbatic year, we have quite simply that every 7 years, all personal debts were forgiven. Anything that a person loaned to his brother, to his neighbor, was forgiven at the culmination of this 7th sabbatical year. And it's interesting, Moses even says in verses 7 and 8, beware that you don't hold back something to your neighbor. Beware that you don't refuse to give something to your brother, knowing that the 7th year is approaching. Now, for example, let's say Dave Roberts comes up to me at the end of church and says, "Jeremy, I'm craving for some Taco Bell, but I didn't bring my cash and didn't bring my card. Can you loan me $5 for some tacos?" I would generously, of course, Dave. I know the sabbatic year is a few years away, so I know I'm going to get my $5 from Dave. as soon as he has that $5 back. Now, Moses says, now, Jeremy, if the sabbatic year is tomorrow at midnight tonight, don't you withhold that $5 from Dave. He needs some tacos. I cannot withhold from Dave the $5 for tacos, knowing that the sabbatic year is approaching. And if I don't hold back from Dave, Moses says, you're going to be blessed in all your undertakings if you do this. If you generously give, regardless of ever being paid back. Maybe he never pays me my $5 back, and that's great. I'm happy for him. I'm happy that he got some tacos today. And I'm going to be blessed in my endeavors because I'm graciously giving to Dave. Now, I want you to notice, and maybe you picked up on this, in verse 2, what is the bedrock principle surrounding this sabbatic year? The bedrock principle is, at the end of verse 2, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. Think about what God had done, even up until this point in history, to the Jews. God had freed the Jews from Egyptian bondage. They had not only been freed as slaves and been allowed to leave Egypt, they plundered Egypt. They plundered a mighty nation in world history at the time. They were given all the goods that they could carry as they left the land of Egypt. That was based on God's grace. It was based on God's remission. The Jews had been promised a land. They had been promised houses that they hadn't built. They had been promised harvest from vines that they had never planted. They had been given freely from God all of this. The Jews had a system of laws enacted so that God could be with them. God could roll forward and overlook the sins that they had committed based on His remission, based on His grace. And so because God's grace had been poured out to the Jews, God's remission had been poured out to this people, they were to pour out themselves grace because they had been given it. This principle extends, actually, if you go back into Leviticus chapter 25, the principle of the 7-year sabbatical is extended even further. In Leviticus chapter 25, beginning of verse 8, there's a separate and further sharing of grace. Verse 8 of Leviticus 25, Moses says, you are to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month, and on the day of atonement you shall sound a horn all through your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. And each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow, nor reap in its aftergrowth, nor gather and form from its untrimmed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat its crops out of the field. On this year of jubilee, each of you shall return to his own property. If you continue reading in Leviticus chapter 25, you'll see further enumerated that at this 50th year, this year of Jubilee, after 7 sabbatical years, all the people's land was to be restored to them. Now let's continue on in our tacos example. Let's say theoretically, Dave is so in need of tacos, he has so little money to fund this taco habit that he sells me the rights to his house. And I'm happy to take Dave's house from him so that I can fund his tacos. At the end of this 50-year period, what am I supposed to do? Now, Dave's probably not going to be around in 50 years, but to his children, what am I supposed to give his just the law of probabilities, Dave. Don't take offense to it. What am I supposed to give to his children? I'm supposed to allow freely, graciously, his land to be restored to him. I did not purchase Dave's home. I purchased the use of Dave's home. I am to graciously, in this year of Jubilee, when I hear the ram's horn sounded, restore everything to Dave's family. This was essentially, just like the sabbatical year, trusting in God. because God has given us so much. God has given us more than we could ever need. Even if someone sells the rights to his land, those rights are to be restored at the end of this sabbatical period, this 50th year Jubilee celebration. God is going to bless the people with enough so that they can do this freely. They can restore freely everything that's been loaned, everything that's been borrowed, everything that's been temporarily shared is restored to the families. Now, one final principle here. I think it's quite interesting how the captivity length is described. And I say that based on the two laws that we've just talked about, entirely based on God's grace. In 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 21, the captivity is described as lasting, in verse 21 of 2 Chronicles 36, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. It says, all the days of its desolation it kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete. You know what that tells you is the Jews had never followed these principles. They had never given the land its Sabbath rests. They had never shared and forgiven debts as God has commanded them to. And again, that's not the reason they went into captivity, but it is quite interesting that the captivity was measured based on the period of Sabbaths that had never been observed. The people had never done this thing. Of course, because it was based on God's grace, it illustrates a lack of trust. The people didn't have a trust in God that they could follow these principles. The people held each other forever accountable for their own mistakes. There was never a forgiveness. There was never a remission among the people. There was never a restoration among the people. Sometimes in our application of grace, we hold each other forever accountable for our own mistakes. We never restore fellowship as we should. See, this doesn't follow God's pattern of redemption. God has redeemed us, and we are to forgive each other and ourselves. We have to understand that God restores us as we should be restored. Another example of grace illustrated in the Bible. You may be familiar with this example. In Luke chapter 15, we have a story, a parable Jesus told called the parable of the prodigal son. I'll quickly tell the story of this prodigal son. There was a man with two sons, older son and the younger son. The younger son approaches his father one day, and to paraphrase, he essentially says, "Dad, I wish you were dead. I wish you were dead so that I could have all of what's coming to me now. I want all my inheritance now, and I don't care whether you live or die. Just give it to me now. My inheritance is worth more to me than my relationship with you as your son." And the father gives it to him. The father gives his son the inheritance that is rightfully his. And within a relatively short period of time, it says the son squandered the estate. Squandered everything with loose living in brothels and bars, online shopping. It's all been spent. There's nothing left. The son is feeding pigs. The son finally comes to his senses, and he says, "The servants in my dad's house live better than I'm living. I need to go back home, and maybe my father will be gracious enough to me that he'll just make me a servant, and I'll at least have it better off than I have it now." And the son comes home. It says the father saw the son coming from afar off. The father restored completely his son to his place as heir. There was no talk about being a servant. The son was restored entirely and completely as an heir, subject again to the inheritance. Now, I don't want to analyze the reactions of the father and the other son too much, but I do want to pick out one phrase that both the father and the son used to describe the prodigal son upon his return. Luke chapter 15 and verse 24, I want you to see how the Father describes the prodigal. The Father describes the prodigal as this son of mine. The younger son never ceased to be his father's son. The father never regarded the lost son as lost. He was still his son. And that's evidenced by the way the father was waiting. The father was always watching, looking in the direction of his son. Maybe today he'll come back. Maybe today he'll come back. It says while he was still a long way off, the father saw him, felt compassion for him. This son of mine has returned. And I can shower him with grace, and I can restore him to his rightful position by my side, because he is my son. When he was away, when he is back, he never ceased to be this son of mine. Now compare that to what the older son says. In verse 30 of in Luke chapter 15, the older son tells his father, that son of yours, that son of yours, he's not my brother, he's a son of yours. In other words, he was never my brother. Even when he was here, in fact, I'm glad he left, because he was never my brother. I never wanted to share anything with him. I'm glad he left, and I wish he hadn't come back. He was unwilling to share in the celebration of the return of his brother. The older brother had judged for himself. The younger brother was unworthy of favor. He was unworthy of the grace that the father was willing to give him. He had judged for himself his brother unworthy of God's grace. That's quite a stark contrast, isn't it? Sometimes I can fall into this pattern where I think that person is not worthy of grace. He's not worthy of forgiveness. Look at what he done. That guy over there, that son of yours is not worthy of the grace that God gives him. That's wrong. The Father showered grace on this son of mine. He never ceased to be his son, and they never cease to be our brothers. And they're worthy because God has said they're worthy of his grace. We have to match the pattern of grace that God gives. Another interesting example of grace that's shown in two reactions to grace. Matthew chapter 18, we have a parable of two debtors. Two servants who owe debts. In verse 27, there's the first servant described as someone who has a lot of debt. Now this servant owes his master 10,000 talents. Now that in and of itself sounds like a big number, but just how big is that number? You know, I'm a numbers guy. I'm a CPA, I'm an analytic guy, and I just had to look for myself. How much is 10,000 talents? Well, one talent is 15 to 20 years of labor in laborers' wages. So I said, well, let's just put some numbers to this beyond 15 years, because that 15 years and 10,000, it's all kind of confusing. So let's just say minimum wage is $7.50 an hour. Let's just say you work 2,080 hours, which is the number of hours. If you work 40 hours a week for 52 weeks, it's 2,080 times $7.50 an hour times 15 years times 10,000. You can see that those zeros are going to be adding up pretty quick. Do you know what that equates to? That equates to 2.34 billion with a B, $2.34 billion. There are only about 2,000 billionaires in the world. Now that may sound like a big number, but let's just suffice it to say 99.9% of people will never amass a fortune of $2 billion. Most people won't amass a fortune of $1 million. But this guy has amassed debt equal to 99%, what will never even be comprehended as wealth. And this guy has amassed that much debt to this one individual. And yet, it says his master had compassion, and he forgave the entire debt. He forgave debt worth a fortune beyond what almost everyone will ever have, and yet his debt was forgiven from a compassionate master. He let this man go free. He let his family go free. There's no debtor's prison. No, you're done. I wrote it off. Don't worry about it. Go and be happy. There is no debt. That's almost incomprehensibly large. The amount of grace is almost incomprehensible that this person was shown. And yet, this same servant, in verse 30, another servant owes this guy, the guy that had just been forgiven $2.3 billion, a guy that had just found $2 billion in his couch cushions. And this person is unwilling to forgive a debt of 200 denarii. A denarii is 1 day's labor. Now, using our same mathematical principles, let's say 8 hours a day is a typical laborer's day, times $7.50 an hour, times 200 days, almost a year's worth of work for a laborer. It's about $12,000. So I have been forgiven $2.3 billion, Jeff Bezos money, that I just found, and yet I throw Dave into prison for a debt exponentially smaller. What's $12,000? That's nothing, comparatively speaking. This petty, hypocritical slave was unwilling to share even a microscopic measure of grace with his fellow servant. The master finds out about it, of course, and says to the wicked, petty slave, should you not also have had mercy on your fellow slave in the same way that I had mercy on you? Should you not have shared a small measure of the grace that you'd been given? Of course, he throws him into prison until he pays back his $2.3 billion of debt, which is to say forever, and his children forever, and his grandchildren forever. They'll never pay back that debt. You know, what's interesting, kind of switching thoughts here and making it a little bit more personal, how much debt have we been forgiven? Just bear with me for a second and consider in Mark chapter 8 where Jesus says, how much are you going to gain if you get the whole world and lose your soul? Another way of thinking of that is to say, if you sold your soul for the entirety of the riches in the world, everything in the world you owned, $2.3 billion times 20, times 30, times 100, all of that is yours. But your soul is worth more than that. So if we have been given back our souls, we have been given back on the basis of God's grace, our souls. How much debt have we been forgiven? More than this guy. If we've been forgiven the whole world's riches and then some, how much grace have we been shown, and how much grace are we expected to share? How willing are we to be gracious to each other if we've been shown an abundance beyond what we can even comprehend of grace? Should we ever be slow to give forgiveness? Should we ever forget our complete reliance on God's forgiveness and be so gracious to each other that we can't even comprehend it? No. We should have mercy and grace with each other in the same way that God has had grace on us. Even after having studied this lesson, it's still difficult to comprehend just how gracious we should be with each other, just how gracious God has been and will be willing to be as we go on through life. He is willing, God is willing to share grace beyond the measure of the world's riches. He's already shown that. Romans chapter 8 says if He's already given you everything. He's already given you Jesus Christ. Is there anything God's going to withhold from you? Well, of course, no. The conclusion is no. And the application then is we study grace. We cannot limit God's forgiveness for ourselves and for each other. There is never a point where God will not accept us back, where He will withhold grace from us. He's been willing to give us everything. He will always be willing to give us everything if we come back as the prodigal did. But also, He's willing to give all of our brothers that. And we should be willing to give all of our brothers that forgiveness, to acknowledge God's forgiveness applied to each other and to us. So this morning, what I want to tell you is that there is nothing withholding God's grace from you except you. And there is nothing withholding God's grace from someone else. And so we all should recognize God's grace and live sharing God's grace. Live in a way that is worthy of the manner in which we've been called, as Paul says. And so this morning, if you need grace, it is ready and waiting. God is looking for you to come back to it. And if there's anything else that we can help you with to encourage you as you walk, you can come forward as we sing the invitation song.